Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Detective Diaries. I can't believe I'm at 20 already. So cool. Thank you to all of you who have watched and subscribed and liked my videos. I really appreciate it. And for all the comments, I love seeing your comments and having a chat with a few of you. If you're new here, I am known as the House Detective. I research the history of houses for my business, and this is where I share some of the cool stuff I've uncovered during my research. This video, what have we got coming up? We've got tuberculosis cottages. We've got a fantastic poster from 1982 that captures Brisbane CBD as it looked that year. We've got some cool sources of information at the Queensland State Archives. I know, it's only here that you're going to hear cool and archives in the same sentence. Trust me, it's awesome. Then we're going to have a look at some female convicts and where they had to be housed to try and keep the men away from them. Finally, I am going to show you this incredible house at Indooroopilly. If you love mid-century modern sleek Palm Springs type design, you will love this house. So stay tuned for that. So let's get straight into it. I hope you enjoy watching. In episode 14 of the Detective Diaries, I discussed the Anzac Cottages scheme. And I'll give you a quick summary here, but go back and watch that if you haven't already. Basically, it was a charitable scheme that was designed to provide houses for returned servicemen following the First World War, or if they had died during their service, to provide housing for their widows and children. It was a remarkable scheme, and most of the land was donated, and then the supplies and timber to build the houses was often also donated, or money was raised by members of the public to cover the costs. And one way they did this was through the Golden Casket lottery scheme. Later on, this program also expanded to include supplying houses to soldiers who had returned from the First World War suffering from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a lung infection caused by a bacteria, and it's really debilitating, so you have trouble breathing and it really impacts on your quality of life. The house that I was hired to research was actually built under this scheme. It was built for a returned serviceman who was suffering from tuberculosis. And at the time he returned from the First World War and into the 1920s, the treatment for tuberculosis primarily involved providing fresh air, ventilation, plenty of outdoor activities, fresh food, and rest. So now it's treated easily with antibiotics, but back then that was sort of, it didn't cure the disease, but it certainly helped manage it and improve the symptoms. So George Mackay Williamson ended up residing at a sanatorium at Stanthorpe, which is a remarkable story in itself, and I covered that briefly in episode 14. But George Mackay Williamson spent some time there, and then once this tuberculosis cottage scheme got up and running, you could, if you were suffering from TB as a returned serviceman, you could apply to have one of these cottages built for you. There are a number of records that survive that are the application forms filled out by returned servicemen and submitted to try and get one of these tuberculosis cottages, as they were called. George Mackay Williamson was one of them. He was not successful initially. That was in 1924, and the following year in 1925 he actually bought a block of land for himself in Brisbane. Then shortly after that, the land is transferred to the public curator of Queensland, which is now the public trustee of Queensland, and they were the trustee for the management of the Anzac Cottage and Tuberculosis Cottage scheme. So the ownership of these blocks of land was transferred into the ownership of the public curator's office as the trustee. And it actually says, and this, I just find this really interesting, on the certificate of title that was issued in their name, it actually specifies that the land is to be the site for a home for an ex-soldier or ex-sailor affected by TB. So it's actually a covenant over the land that it can only be used for that purpose. Then I looked a little bit more into these Anzac and tuberculosis cottages, and It was so cool because it turns out that there is actually a register of these cottages that were built under this scheme, and it's held at the Brisbane City Council Archives. Sorry, that's a record of ones that were built in the Brisbane City Council area. And these record who they were built for, when they were first occupied, and any transfer of ownership. So if the person living there passed away or they wanted to move elsewhere, then it would go to another ex-serviceman with TB, or if none were available, then widow or dependents of a ex-serviceman that suffered from it. So absolutely incredible story, so fascinating. These TB cottages were designed by the Workers' Dwellings Board. I've covered this briefly, I think, in previous videos, but it was a department of the Queensland government that was responsible for designing and constructing affordable homes for what were then called working class, hence the workers' dwellings. Now they would be lower socio-economic demographic. But they had a range of standard designs that they used, particularly for the Anzac cottages. But the TB cottages were something special. There is one aspect of the design of these cottages which is unique to these TB cottages. They had extra wide front verandas. These verandas were about 3 meters in width, which is about 10 feet in the old measurements. And this is a lot wider than most standard verandas at the time these were built. So we're looking at the 1920s mainly for these TB cottages. And this was because these front verandas were designed to be wide enough so that the person with TB could actually spend a lot of time out on these verandas, and they were sometimes called sleep out verandas because they were semi-enclosed as well. Normally in later iterations, post-war homes, a sleep out veranda was fully enclosed with windows, but these were partially enclosed with balustrades to sill height, lined and sealed, and then openings above them. But these wide verandas were a unique characteristic of these TB cottages. So I just think that that's incredible, because if you didn't know the story of this house, you would turn up, you would look at this house and you would go, geez, that's a really wide veranda, but you probably wouldn't really think anything else of it. And then when you know what they were built for and the story behind them, it just all fits so perfectly together. It's fantastic. I love it. The house I was researching is actually one of a number of these TB cottages that survived, and they're scattered all throughout Brisbane, and they're in various states of alteration. Some have been completely changed to the point where they're unrecognisable, and some of them are very little changed, and most of them are actually on the Brisbane City Council Heritage Register. So just a fascinating class of housing, and once again, like I've said before, I never know where my house research is going to take me. This just shows too that even a humble, unimposing house, very simple basic design, it can have the most incredible story behind it. And I absolutely love uncovering these histories and sharing them. In the last episode, I shared that fantastic poster that showed some images of buildings in Brisbane and some streetscapes of Brisbane in 1894. Well, this fortnight, I wanted to share this fantastic poster with you. It's a Warana poster, and I have, for some reason, have trouble saying that word, so I'll probably stumble over it again in this clip. For those of you who don't remember, Warana was basically a Brisbane-based celebration, and there was a whole heap of different things involved there. The things I remember vaguely are there was like a street parade with floats and celebration, that type of thing, but there was always a cluster of other events associated with it. And it eventually evolved into the Brisbane Festival that we know today, with River Fire and all the other fantastic celebrations that go on. But Warana was a really big thing back in the day, and I'm sure many of you probably have memories of it. And when I came across this poster, first of all, I'd completely forgotten about Warana until I saw this. But I love it because it includes a drawing of the CBD, and it shows what it looked like, and it even captures a few other things in the background. So there's a bit of South Brisbane and even the TV towers at Mount Cootha. So it's just this really cool snapshot of what Brisbane looked like in 1982, as well as being a bit nostalgic, reminding me of these great festivals and celebrations that used to happen in Brisbane. If I didn't mention it, the poster's from Brisbane City Council Archives, and this isn't the first time actually that I've come across something related to Warana connected to the Brisbane City Council archives. So I went to the archives one day to research a house. I spend a fair bit of time there. They have some great resources for house history research. And I turned up and I walked into the research room, and in amongst all the historical documents and other booklets and bits and pieces, there was a couple of rubber ducks sitting on the desk. So that was a little bit out of the ordinary, and I was very, very curious. So of course I had to ask what the story was behind them. And apparently at one of the Warana festivals, and I'm hoping maybe some of you remember or can tell me more about it, that there was a rubber duck race on the Brisbane River as part of the festival one year. And these ducks apparently that were at the archives were part of that event. So yeah, let me know if you remember what year that was, or if you remember anything about it. Was it every year? Was it like a regular thing, or was it just one particular year? And do you have photos of it? Tell me your memories. Share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear. And I imagine that it's not the type of thing you would forget readily, seeing hundreds and hundreds of rubber ducks on the Brisbane River. Maybe we should bring it back. That'd be pretty cool. Yeah, let's do that. I mentioned I spend a fair bit of time at the Brisbane City Council archives, and the other place I sometimes go for my house research is the Queensland State Archives. They're at Runcorn. The State Archives hold documents that are connected to the operation of the Queensland government in the past. So they hold all the archive records from all government departments. So in this way, there's not often a lot of information for individual houses, but there are some fantastic family history resources out there. So you can view old wills, you can view coroner's reports if it was a suspicious or unexpected death. You can view a whole range of those types of records, and they're also really good for researching rural properties that began life as a lease from the government. And I'll actually cover the dead farm files in the next fortnight's episode. So they hold a range of different collections, and the only time you're really going to find any information generally on an individual private house is if it was built under a social housing scheme. So Queensland Housing Commission, or the precursors to that, the State Advances Corporation, Workers Dwellings Board. So I occasionally need to go out there for different things. One of the other times I go to the State Archives is if I'm ever hired to research a house that's on the Queensland Heritage Register. When a house is nominated, or a property or building is or place is nominated to the Queensland Heritage Register, the staff in that branch will undertake a heap of research to work out whether or not it meets the criteria for being added to the Heritage Register. Now, I've done a whole other video on the different types of Heritage Register and the different criteria, so you might want to check that one out if you're not familiar with it. But basically, all this research information and documents, a range of different information that the research officer has collected in the process of researching these properties, they're all now held in files at the State Archives. So rather than reinventing the wheel, if I'm hired to research a property that's on the register, I'll go out and I'll have a look through all this information. Now, often they didn't have the time or the obsessiveness that I do, so I can often add a lot more information, and also there's so many more resources and online and digital information available since some of the early ones were first added. So the register started in 1992. You can imagine the advances in research, access online, and different documents that are now available that weren't available back then. But anyway, one of my favourite things that you can sometimes find in the early Heritage Register research files are collections of slides. So if you're as old as I am, or older, you will remember what it was like to put your film in out of your camera to get developed, and then if you wanted, you could request that the images were sent back as slides. You would then have a projector that you fed the slides into, or a big round carousel that you'd put the slides into, and you'd have the projector and a big screen that you would pull up, and you would click through and view the slides. So the light would be behind the slide and it would project it onto the screen like a TV image these days. The main thing I remember from slide nights as a kid was my sister and brother and I fighting over who got to press the button to advance the slides, but we still occasionally have them, and it's so cool. It's so nostalgic to have a bit of a flashback to our childhood and old ways of recording images. Now, where was I? Yes, slides at the State Archives. They have often got these slides included with the research files for these Heritage Register properties because that's the technology that was available at the time when they were first recording them. And it's really cool. They've got these really cool light boxes that you use now where you put the sheet that's got all the slides in it over this light box and you can get a good look at these slides without having to have a projector. And you can actually get a semi-decent photo on your phone or your camera if you are just photographing the slide close up as well, which is really cool. So yeah, it's the whole process. It's the fact that these houses, you can find old photos of these properties and places back from when they were added to the register. Which can actually be really useful, particularly for tracking additions and alterations made to the building, seeing what they were like basically, God, what is it now, 30 years ago. I feel like the 90s were only yesterday, but anyway. So yeah, just, I don't know why, it just toots my flute being able to look at these old slides at the archives. Number 2, female convicts in the female factory. I mentioned in my tour of Woolston House, which I put up a few weeks ago. If you haven't watched that, check it out. It's one of my favourite historic homes to visit in Brisbane. It's Brisbane's oldest surviving farm house. It's so cool. Check it out, have a look, and go and visit if you get a chance. But I mentioned that the guy who built Woolston House was Stephen Simpson. Simpson arrived in Brisbane in 1841, and this is a really interesting time, a massive change in Brisbane's history because it's right on the cusp of the Moreton Bay Penal Colony becoming Brisbane town. So in 1841, basically the convict operations here are winding down. Most of the convicts have been sent elsewhere, and in 1842 the area is open up to free settlers. The only free people that were allowed to be in Moreton Bay during the operation of the convict colony were the officers and commanders in charge, so the military members that were overseeing the operations, and then there was also a small group of German missionaries who had established a site out at what is today Nunda. Apart from that, no free settlers were allowed within, I'm pretty sure it was 50 miles of the convict colony, which is about 80 kilometres. And so Simpson is arriving on the cusp of this transition, and because he's a government employee, he's working for the colonial government in New South Wales, he is allocated housing. And although a number of records state that he was living in buildings out at the female factory at Eagle Farm, it's not clear exactly what building he was living in, but it might have been the superintendent's cottage which was out there. I sort of knew a little bit about this female factory. I knew that the women were originally housed in barracks that are located on Queen Street where the GPO is in the CBD today, but I didn't know much more about this site out at Eagle Farm. And so I looked into it a little bit further, and it turns out that basically they had to move the female convicts out of Brisbane and away from the male convicts who were also housed in a different building on Queen Street, basically to prevent fraternisation. And it was actually the army officers that were a bigger problem than the male convicts, which I found quite funny. So basically they had to move the female prisoners out to a site at Eagle Farm, and apparently they had to build like really solid cells surrounded by a picket fence and things to try and keep the males out, and well, probably keep the women in and keep the males out. Eagle Farm was established as a new agricultural area to supply food for the convict settlement in 1829. And if you know your Brisbane history, you will know that that is the same year that the commissariat store on Queen's Wharf was built as well. So some of the produce produced on this Eagle Farm would have probably been stored in that commissariat building. It's also a year after the windmill, so it's very early on in Brisbane's European history. But basically, they eventually moved the women out here, and there were a number of buildings out there. So there was actually a workshop, which is what they mean when they say the factory, where the women were employed in different jobs. There was a kitchen, there was a residence for the superintendent of that site, and I suspect that's probably where Simpson was moved into. And then there was a number of outbuildings and other agricultural and farm buildings as well. Now, this site was subject to development in 2014, and as part of this development, they undertook an archaeological dig, and they actually uncovered remnants of some of this former occupation, including the foundations of the superintendent's cottage. And I kind of knew there was some sort of heritagey, precincty type area out at Eagle Farm, but I actually looked into it, and it's actually in an area that is called Trade Coast Central Heritage Park. And this includes 3 different sites, 2 which are connected to World War II, as well as these early convict remnants. And there's a museum there, and you can go out and you can walk around the site where this female factory was located. So that's now top of my to-do list in terms of places to visit. I really must get out there. It just looks really cool. Looking forward to going and exploring. So that was an interesting, side tangent that came out of researching Simpson and Wolston House. Finally, as I mentioned, this is a bit of a treat for mid-century modern MCM lovers, or people that love their post-war modernist homes. A friend actually sent me a link to this house, thanks Saxon, because his family had owned it and he used to live there. It is a stunning mid-century modern home. Now, what do I mean by mid-century modern? Well, the mid-century refers to mid-1900s, so 1950s, but a little bit either side of that. And the modern refers to a style of architecture that was really popular, particularly after the Second World War in Queensland and the rest of the world. And it refers to a style of architecture that is very minimalist, very sleek, very little decoration. They were designed particularly for the climate. They had lots of big glass windows, lots of cross ventilation, that type of thing. So basically they were really ahead of the game, because this is all stuff that we like in our homes today. And when you look back at the style of a lot of these houses, they are very similar to modern homes that are being built today, and they hold up really well in terms of their styling and detailing, and they're very livable by today's standards. This one is slightly different. It is so quirky and completely unlike anything else I've ever seen. I would still classify it as mid-century modern, but it is definitely unusual, and it features a lot of curves, whereas most modernist homes featured a lot of straight lines, sleek lines, a lot of horizontal detailing. This place was designed by architect Donald Spencer and built in 1968. Now, Donald Spencer was a really prominent architect in post-war Brisbane, and he designed a number of cutting-edge mid-century modern homes, and I've seen quite a few of them, and they are all amazing, but this one is something special. It's unique in, I would say, not only his collection of houses, but also in Brisbane architecture in general. Known as the Roundhouse, it was built for his family. It's at Indooroopilly. It's absolutely incredible, and I just wanted to share some photos with you for now because it's on the market and it is just such an incredible house. And I mean, it's such a cliche, but they don't make them like this anymore. It's just incredible, and it's just so amazing to me that it has survived so little change after all this time, and I really hope the new owners are sympathetic mid-century modern lovers and don't change it much either. That brings us to the end of episode 20 of the Detective Diaries. Thanks for watching, and you know the drill. Please click like, please subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps my channel get out there and get viewed by more people who love history as much as we do.